Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. I wanted to follow up on some additional material I had uncovered while researching early Philadelphia theater, but was unable to fit into our first episodes. Or rather, I was perhaps a bit unwilling to show this side of the Philadelphia theater world to the general public at such an early stage in the podcast. At the beginning of things, I was trying to burnish and expand the city's image in theatrical history, not air out its dirty laundry. But by this point, maybe we've earned the ability to deal with some uncomfortable truths. I've decided to call this episode The Theater of Cruelty, for reasons we shall soon discover. We all know that the city of Philadelphia has a bit of a reputation, nationally, as a place with unruly, rude, and even violent sports fans. Now, I'm not here to argue whether that is true or not. Sports are not really our topic here, but we have to acknowledge that the reputation is there. Well, there were times in the first 2 decades of the 19th century when Philadelphia theater audiences fully lived up to that reputation for unruliness, rudeness, and even cruelty. Now, Philadelphia audiences were not alone in that respect. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, theater audiences everywhere fully expected to be allowed to freely voice their opinions, shouting at the actors, shouting at other audience members, catcalls, jeers. That was all par for the course. Disputes about political and social issues could easily erupt. If your political opponent was in the house, you could speak to him directly, or you could do so indirectly by what you chose to applaud, or what songs you and your friends demanded that the orchestra play in between acts. Theaters were a mix between private and public spaces, and people felt they had a right to be there since they had paid their money. They could express their ardent approval and disapproval. It was all part of the experience. Sometimes objects were even thrown at the actors, and we're not talking just rotten tomatoes or other objectionable but at least soft items. While reading through the source books for this material in memoirs of actors who performed on Philadelphia stages, I can find references to buttons, firecrackers, musket balls, even knives being occasionally tossed onto the stage. In this, as other things, Philadelphians were following the lead of British theater-goers. In 1809, after all, were the famous London O.P. riots, or Old Price riots, for example. The Covent Garden Theater had just been rebuilt after a fire on a huge scale. It was twice the size as it had been before, holding about 3,000 people. And to cover their costs, management had raised ticket prices, especially for the pit, from which time immemorial had been the province of rougher and ruder types of audience members. The deeply resentful pit regulars at Covent Garden, in retaliation, came up with a plan. They came to the theater, but night after night they refused to pay attention to the performers. Instead, they held dances, they played cards, they shouted, and they chanted, "We want the old prices," in the full view and to the dismay of all the toffs and the swells in the private boxes up above. They kept up the demonstrations every show for months. The actor-manager of the theater, John Philip Kemble, tried berating the mob from the stage. That didn't work, nor did hiring professional boxers to spar with the troublemakers in the crowd. And after the show was over, the OP demonstrators carried on their dances and protested out in the streets. Eventually, John Philip Kemble and the other theater managers gave in, and the old prices were restored. So, similar examples of organized audience misbehavior could be found in Philadelphia. In Episode 8, we saw how Army officers deliberately harassed Congressman John Randolph during the performance of a play in 1800. There were several other deliberate personal attacks by audience members, but these particular times, the ones I'm going to tell you about today, they were directed not against other audience members, but against actors while they performed on the stage. Okay, first story. In 1801, the New Theatre Company had been in search of a new leading tragic actor, since the popular leading man Thomas Cooper had broken his contract with the company and gone off to New York, seeking more lucrative arrangements. Thomas Wignell, the manager, had recruited a promising young man named Fullerton, who had been a leading actor at the Theatre Royal in Liverpool, to fill some of Cooper's former roles, though apparently Fullerton was not considered handsome enough to be assigned to all of Cooper's parts, such as those of Hamlet. The role of the melancholy Dane went instead to another new member of the company. Still, Fullerton was tapped by Wignell to play Macbeth, Hotspur, Pizarro, Petruchio, as well as several other comic roles. Now, he would also take on roles in melodramas of what were generally termed serious fathers, but he was never popular with the Philadelphia crowds, who still missed Cooper. Professional critics felt something was missing too. Joseph Denny, writing as Oliver Oldschool in the Portfolio magazine, called Fullerton's Petruchio more vehement than the part demanded, and that his voice was too loud. Members of the general public, sensing a weakness of spirit in Fullerton, took out their frustration on him. As the season first began, solitary jeers and insults would be shushed by other members of the audience, but as time went on, the number of his detractors grew, and as actor William Wood wrote later in his memoirs, "The disaffected increased nightly in numbers and violence, till at length some 8 or 10 different disturbers, distributed throughout the house, contrived to confuse and distract the performer, who happened to appear in the same scenes with Fullerton." As time wore on, the unfortunate Fullerton began to develop an understandable aversion to being seen in public at all. "He became melancholy and morose," said Wood, "frequently hinting that the death either of his enemies or himself should end his sufferings." Though the other actors of the company attempted to console him, anonymous letters disparaging his talent were even sent to his lodgings at the home of another member of the company, William Francis. Apparently, at least once, Francis even had to stop his friend from doing serious injury to himself. Fullerton gave a performance at the New Theatre on January 29, 1802, as an abbot in the play Deaf and Dumb, but he and everyone else on stage could hear the immediate groans and whistles coming from the audience every time he tried to speak. Wood recalled that "every effort possible was made to ascertain the cause of this continued persecution, but in vain. A nervous man at all times, poor Fullerton became near incapable of all effort. His terror and agony on entering the stage was truly pitiable." After the show, Fullerton went back to William Francis's house and brooded for a week. Everyone in the Francis family attempted to cheer him up by playing a nightly game of cards together, but on the evening of February 3rd, Fullerton suddenly rose from the table, grabbed his hat, and strode out into the night. Everyone anxiously waited for him to return, but he never did. At about midnight, Francis's dog, who had been given the rather ominous name of Banquo, began to howl miserably, and everyone feared the worst. And in fact, Fullerton never came home. In the morning, Mr. Gibbons, the master tailor of the wardrobe department of the theatre, went looking for him, and found the poor actor's hat placed upon a pier of the Vine Street dock on the Delaware. The body rose to the surface of the river a few hours afterwards. It was retrieved, and Fullerton was quietly buried later that day. The publisher Matthew Carey wrote a public letter castigating the actor's persecutors, defending the dramatic profession from their cruelty. "Behold Fullerton's monument," he wrote. "The actor of manly and gentlemanly worth was stabbed to the heart in the Temple of the Muses by a band of Christian critics, even while offering his devotions on the altar of the arts." But no one was ever called to account or even publicly apologized for their ill treatment of Fullerton. His parts were reassigned to others in the company, and the season continued. And I must say that, reading through all the accounts I can find of his sad fate, despite William Carey's pleas, people seem to have hurriedly just put his memory away. Nobody in their memoirs even seemed to be able to remember his first name. His sad end was not, at least, to be the fate of the next victim of a common public disapproval in a Philadelphia theater, but the story is not much prettier. Story number 2. In the season of 1807-1808, with William Wood and William Warren now running the company, a young Irish tenor by the name of Webster was engaged, particularly to play the parts of young lovers in operas, though he also did speaking roles in pantomimes and comedies. Webster was, as we would say today, quite openly gay. Or, as William Wood, who did not share the generally tolerant sentiment towards homosexuality of our own day, put it unkindly, "His deportment and dress were marked and marred by a very disagreeable effeminacy, which the audience endured for the pleasure of his singing." But by the middle of the season, some audience members began to feel the urge to do Webster public harm, noted Wood. "A sudden expression of dislike was seen to attend each of his songs, but seemed limited to a very few persons. Still, it never failed nightly to occur until the interruption became a serious evil to the rest of the audience, as well as to the manager." Though William Wood was primly dancing around the subject of what set off the, quote, "sudden dislike" of certain members of the audience, other memoirists were not so discreet. Quote, "It has been alleged publicly that Webster had been guilty of an attempt to commit a most revolting crime," close quotes, wrote historian Charles Durang. Translation from 19th century speak: Webster had propositioned another man for sex, and his orientation had been publicly exposed. The young bloods of the town, Durang reported, whose ringleader was named John Lohra, Lohra, began to humiliate Webster nightly during his performances at the Chestnut Street Theater. On April 6, 1808, matters came to a head. A performance of a new play by the American author James Nelson Barker, a dramatization of the life of Pocahontas entitled The Indian Princess, was set to play. Webster had the rather minor role of Larry, one of the English settlers of Jamestown, but his tormentors did not care how important he was to the plot. They just hated him and set about shouting insults as soon as he came on the stage. But Webster also had his defenders. Due to the on-the-spot reportage of a short-lived publication called The Tickler, we actually have the names of his horrible chief assailants, and since they deserve being historically shamed, I will name them too. And remember that Philadelphia was not that big a city at the time. Everyone knew each other, and besides, the audience area was not in darkness. You could be seen if you stood up and yelled at the stage. Besides Lohra, reported the Tickler, there was Hugh Lindsay, a clerk, Harry Fries, Adam Takare, Jack Smith the pill maker, and 2 men, whom the tickler described as a puppy, dapper-looking counter-jumper who lives somewhere about the corner of Dock and Pearl Street, and a monkey in men's clothes who proves to be a Frenchman. There were even others, said the reporter, whose names we will not now mention, in hopes of their abandoning such disgraceful conduct in future in the upper boxes. He lets the rich people off the hook, you see. 'Twas ever thus. More than just making verbal threats, all these men's behavior became alarmingly violent to all the actors who were valiantly attempting to continue with the performance of the Indian Princess. The rioters tore down pieces from the glass chandeliers in the theater's lobbies, hurling them in Webster's general direction. Lighted squibs or firecrackers were even thrown down onto the stage. But also jumping to Webster's defense that night were his own countrymen, his fellow Irishmen, who by that point formed a considerable minority in the city of Philadelphia, great fans of Webster's voice, which often serenaded them with Irish songs. They immediately started fighting with the homophobic hecklers, blacking eyes and bloodying noses throughout the lobbies and saloons of the theater. The fights even spread to the rooms of what was called the Shakespeare Building next door. Meanwhile, on stage, the managers of the theater decided to call a halt to the show and brought down the curtain. The audience hurried out as Philadelphia's constables and watchmen, because there was no constituted municipal police force at the time, ran inside to break up the fights. Meanwhile, 300 other Irishmen, by one estimate, gathered at the stage door of the new theater to protect and escort Webster home on their shoulders to his lodging on George Street. However, manager William Warren, quite unconscionably, I think, seemed to blame the young tenor for the entire affair. Confronting him the following day, Warren lost his temper and fired Webster from the company. Now, this was very rash of Warren and ended up costing him quite dearly because Webster had a contract and quickly insisted on his legal rights and sued Warren, demanding to be paid for the rest of the season. Warren, on the advice of his own lawyers, quickly folded and was forced to give the young man not only his salary, but $1,000 on top of that to compensate him for the loss of his benefit night at the end of the season. Despite this short-term victory, in the long run, Webster's fate was not a happy one. He continued with a concert career at other Philadelphia theaters, and he even married a lady of Philadelphia, but their union, predictably, did not last long. Nor was his sudden fortune of $1,000 well invested. Charles Durang, in his History of the Theater Philadelphia, reports that Webster died, poverty-stricken, years later, in a Baltimore almshouse. Meanwhile, Warren and Wood, the managers of the new theater, installed a coffee house in the lobby in order to attract more ladies to the building. You see, it was thought that the presence of more females in the establishment would have a calming effect, or at least a restraining one, on bad behavior by Philadelphia's young men. But that was not necessarily going to work, it turned out, because William Wood's memoir contains one more truly hair-raising story about a riot in the new theater on Chestnut Street. It is such a particularly alarming tale that I'm mostly going to let his own words narrate it, with some internal elisions. These all come from pages 143 to 154 of his memoir, Personal Recollections of the Stage, which he wrote and published several decades later, but evidently the events remained quite vivid to him, for he recounts them in great detail. All right, story number 3. This one is about Donald Mackenzie, an actor in the company who was originally from Scotland. The story begins in 1811, during a time of economic downturn in the country. It is also a time when many of the actors of the new theater company were getting restive about what they were getting paid for their efforts. Many of them were trying to break away and find a more lucrative employment elsewhere in some rival theaters that were just starting to spring up. Here's how Wood tells it. In my early days, I had been struck with the natural performance of a novice at the John Street Theatre in New York, a trifling character, represented by a young man named Mackenzie. This novice was quite young, and a strong Scotch accent perhaps tended to strengthen this effect. Years later, employed and regularly attached to our company, he gradually overcame the impression which his strong accent occasionally made, and he became, in the course of 5 years, a decided favourite in parts of severity and harshness. Useful on the stage, and not uncivil, his manner was yet that of a character which can be better understood by the terms dogged and sulky. In the summer of this year, 1811, to which we have now come, on a day previous to a performance of The Deserted Daughter, when our bills announced Mr. Mackenzie in the character of Mordaunt, a counter-announcement was circulated of Mr. Mackenzie's first appearance at the Walnut Street house, to be opened on that night. This announcement was not known, however, until noon, Mackenzie having attended our rehearsal in the morning. The circumstance was wholly inexplicable, as not the slightest complaint or difficulty had occurred. The rest of the day was employed with vain attempts to find the absentee. And at this point I should break in and say that the managers of the theatre, Warren and Wood, never did find Mackenzie, and Wood himself was forced to step into the role of Mordaunt. Okay, back to Wood. No message or information was received from Mackenzie, and the theatre opened as usual. At the rising of the curtain, a stormy scene soon commenced, with my first entrance as Mordaunt. A brutal effusion of hisses, howlings, imprecations, and all other expressions most offensive were heard from different parts of the house. The rest of the audience, unconscious of the cause, as were the actors, endeavored to suppress the interruption by applause, but were soon overpowered by the organized disturbers. On my next appearance, the savage clamours increased to a degree so alarming as to cause the hurried departure of the largest portion of the lady audience. Numerous respectful efforts were made to attain a hearing, but without effect. Whenever I approached the stage boxes in my scenes, the cries of "Kill him! Drive him from the stage! Kill him!" were repeated. Mr. Dwyer, who was playing with me, was excessively mortified, and pronounced it a more ferocious riot than he had ever witnessed in the rudest Irish theatres. The play concluded, as it began, in noise and confusion, without the slightest intimation of what the disturbance arose for. Romeo and Juliet was scheduled for the following evening. Perfect quiet prevailed until the appearance of Romeo, which I was performing, when the former disgusting scenes were repeated, and continued without intermission. In the last act, when Romeo brought forward the awakened Juliet from her tomb, the lady, my wife, acting this part, received a violent blow in the arm from a musket ball thrown from an upper box near the stage. Advancing to the front, I demanded to be heard, and offered a large reward for the discovery of the miscreant who had disgraced manhood and decency by such a murderous outrage. A universal cry from the audience to put down the curtain concluded the scene. I resolved to call on our legal counsel. I proceeded alone, by the stage door, to the corner of 6th and Chestnut Street, when at once it was evident that the mob had caught sight of me. They recommenced the brutal yells and hooting which I had just experienced in the theatre. At this moment I was joined by a gentleman, Mr. Edward Taubman, Jr., who had been at the play, and was induced by the noise outside to leave the theatre, suspecting that something was wrong. He put his arm through mine, and coolly remarked that we were in for it. Handing him one of the pistols with which I had prepared myself on leaving the theatre, and retaining the other, as well as my sword cane, which I usually carried, we proceeded on our way. By the time we reached the front of the State House building, many attempts were made to press upon us. At each attempt, Mr. Tilghman warned them of their danger from our weapons. The crowd, although individually reluctant to encounter peril, yet as a group were endeavoring to press forward upon us, shouting like savages. At this moment, 2 gentlemen rushed down the steps of the hall and forced their way in until they reached us. They anxiously inquired in very firm, foreign accents how it happened that 2 men should thus be surrounded by so fierce a crowd. The 2 strangers, whom I always supposed to be French officers, placed themselves at our side, and in the calmest of manners assured us that they should accompany us wherever we were going, and if needful share in our fate. We 4 proceeded to Walnut Street below 5th, where my legal counsel then lived, unmolested. Now, that was a rough night on the stage. Wood doesn't remark on the possibility, but I like to think that the 2 Frenchmen were members of the new circus company on Walnut Street, perhaps even Pepin and Breschard themselves, but there's no way of knowing that now. It later transpired that the crowd of rioters and hecklers were all Scotsmen, members of the weaving trade, who were then arriving in great numbers from Perth and Glasgow to work in the textile mills, then rising in Frankfurt and Kensington, north of the city of Philadelphia. It turned out that the actor Mackenzie had purposely spread rumors that his boss, William Wood, was anti-Scotch, and that the manager habitually indulged publicly and privately in most insulting attacks upon the Scots portion of our citizens, as well as upon mechanics in masses. This rumor was meant to cause exactly the uproar that it did in order to extort from Wood an agreement to let Mackenzie out of the company so that he might be free to pursue an independent acting career without being sued for breach of contract. But his plans being foiled, and upon actually being sued by Warren and Wood, Mackenzie quickly sent abject letters of apology, according to Wood, and left town trying to keep his theatrical career alive in other American cities. Wood notes with sour satisfaction that Mackenzie ended up in abject poverty and alcoholism, living in Boston. Like many other actors, he was too fond of putting an enemy into his mouth, and was more than once discharged for indulging in this vice. Confined to his room, owing to his indulgence, he sent for a physician, who, seeing his condition, wrote a receipt. Water. Use it freely. Mackenzie, glancing at the prescription, exclaimed, "Why, doctor, water'll be the death of me." And sure enough, it was, for the last that was to be seen of him alive was walking towards Back Bay, where his body was found after he had been missing several days. And then Wood, rather coolly, turns towards discussing the receipts of the next week at the theater. He was, after all, both an artist and a man of business. Well, that's my 3 tales of bad behavior by Philadelphia theater audiences in the early 19th century. I'll try to remember them the next time I get a mere bad review. Time was, of course, when a mob of critics that didn't like you might be waiting for you outside the stage door. I suppose we could find more if we looked for it. Back in episode 11, we described in detail some more alarming behavior by Philadelphians, most particularly the riot at Vauxhall Gardens on Broad Street in the year 1818, when the crowd, disappointed that a planned balloon ascent did not come off, burned the entire place down. You should go back and listen to that one if you missed it. But as the 19th century continued, expectations of audience behavior began to change. More and more, the upper classes began to separate themselves from places where the working classes would go to be entertained. We'll learn soon about the construction of the Academy of Music in the mid-19th century and how that shifted the entire social framework of Philadelphia theater going. And as the burgeoning middle classes, with their emphasis on private manners and public respectability, began to predominate in the large majority of American places of entertainment, those expectations began to affect what would be tolerated in the theater. We already saw, for instance, how Louisa Lane Drew tidied up the Arch Street Theater. By the end of the 1800s, Philadelphia theater became so safe and so ubiquitous that almost everybody of every age and class and religion were going into a theater of some sort during the course of a year. Now, there was the story of the demonstrations that broke out in Philadelphia in the year 1912 over a performance of J.M. Singh's The Playboy of the Western World. Amazingly, both the demonstrators and the actors ended up getting arrested. But that is a story for another day. It's quite a tale, and I'm still in the process of researching it. There's always another amazing story to tell about Philadelphia theater history. Some of them are just a bit more alarming than others, that's all. In our next episode, we'll talk about building something up, not tearing something down. We're going to learn about the founding and the construction of the Academy of Music on Broad Street, right across from where the Vauxhall Gardens used to be. It is the grandest theatrical space in Philadelphia. It still stands there today, and it's the place, really, that taught Philadelphia audiences how to be on their best behavior from then on. Thank goodness. I'm Peter Schmitz, and the sound and the music are by Christopher Mark Colucci. Thanks for coming along with us on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.